In 1962, the United States Department of Agriculture documented that American farmers were spending over $300 million annually on synthetic insecticides. That figure doubled by 1972, and by 1980, the number of insect species classified as pesticide resistant had grown from fewer than 20 to over 400. The chemical investment was increasing. The pest damage was not decreasing. Now, here is what makes this worth your attention. During that same 20-year period, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, one of the most agriculturally dense county in the northeastern United States, a significant portion of its working farms were applying none of those chemicals. No synthetic pyrethroids, no organophosphates, no scheduled applications of any manufactured compound. These operations ran on rotational planting, specific plant placement, and knowledge that had been passed from one generation to the next without an instruction manual or a product label. They were not failing. They were not losing exceptional quantities of crops to the pest pressure that was defeating operations with access to the full industrial toolkit. Penn State agricultural researchers who studied Lancaster County production during this era noted the persistence of productive yields on farms that, by the logic of modern agronomy, should have been overwhelmed. The average American household gardener today spends between $60 and $200 per growing season on pesticides, sprays, and deterrents, and still loses a meaningful portion of what they planted. Time invested, seeds purchased, harvest never realized. That is not a technology failure. That is a knowledge gap. Something functioned in those Lancaster fields that the chemical era was never designed to replace. It was not faith. It was not luck. It was a system, repeatable, observable, and structurally sound. The question is not whether it worked. The record suggests it did. The question is what exactly it was. Stay with me. What you're about to hear could change how you understand survival. When a supply chain disrupts, it does not disrupt evenly. In March of 2020, within roughly 3 weeks of widespread regional lockdowns across North America, garden supply retailers reported seed shortages not seen since the Second World War. Demand for home food production spiked, but demand for pest control products spiked at the same rate. People were learning in real time that producing food and protecting food are two entirely different problems. The average home gardener's approach to pest management is reactive. Something appears, a product is purchased, it is applied. The pest returns or a new one follows. The cycle repeats. This model functions when supply chains are intact, when retail is accessible, and when a gardener has both the income and the time to manage the loop continuously. Remove any one of those conditions and the system breaks. What most prepared households stock is caloric food. Grains, canned goods, freeze-dried reserves. What almost none of them account for is a method for protecting fresh production during an extended disruption. Fresh vegetables are not just nutritional supplements. Under prolonged stress, they are the difference between adequate caloric intake and micronutrient deficiency. Vitamin C depletion alone becomes clinically relevant within weeks of fresh produce loss. Scurvy is not a historical novelty. It is what happens when a garden fails for 2 consecutive months and there is no backup. The problem with chemical pest control under pressure is not just availability, it is also dependency. A garden built around spray schedules has no pest resistance of its own. The moment the input stops, the vulnerability is total. There is no buffer, no built-in deterrence, no ecological structure that continues working when the gardener cannot intervene. That structural fragility is not accidental. It is the predictable result of building food production around purchased solutions rather than designed resilience. Most people prepare their gardens for a good growing season. Very few prepare them to survive a bad one. The Amish did not invent what they practice. That is an important distinction. What Anabaptist communities carried into Pennsylvania in the early 1700s was German and Swiss agricultural knowledge that had been refined across several centuries of small plot farming in Central Europe. These were farmers operating on limited acreage, without access to synthetic inputs that did not yet exist, who had developed layered systems for managing pest pressure through plant behavior rather than plant death. The foundation of this system is companion planting, but calling it that understates the precision involved. The logic runs like this. Certain plants release volatile organic compounds from their roots or foliage that interfere with the host-finding behavior of specific insect pests. Tansy, Tanacetum vulgare, placed along garden borders or interplanted near brassicas, releases compounds that actively deter Colorado potato beetles and several aphid species. This is not folk claim. The plant's thiojonate and camphor content has been analyzed in agricultural chemistry research, and its deterrent properties against certain beetle species have been confirmed in field trials. Nasturtiums function differently. They do not repel, they attract. Aphids preferentially colonize nasturtium foliage over vegetable crops, concentrating pest populations on a sacrificial plant where they can be managed or tolerated without crop loss. This is trap cropping, a principle now recognized in integrated pest management literature, and it was standard Amish garden design long before academic terminology existed for it. Wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, planted as a perimeter herb, creates a volatile boundary that disrupts the movement of slugs, flea beetles, and some caterpillar species. The active compound, absinthin, is chemically hostile to several invertebrate digestive systems. None of this required belief. It required observation, sequence, and repetition across enough growing seasons to confirm what worked and what did not. These were not traditions passed down because they felt meaningful. They were retained because they produced measurable results in fields where failure had direct consequences. The real test of any system is not how it performs in ideal conditions. It is what remains functional when conditions collapse. During the Second World War, the United States government rationed agricultural chemicals for civilian use. Synthetic pesticide production was redirected toward military applications. DDT was prioritized for typhus and malaria control among troops. Home gardens, which the government was actively encouraging through the Victory Garden program, were expected to produce food with sharply reduced access to the chemical inputs that had, by the early 1940s, already begun replacing older methods. Records from extension services in Pennsylvania and Ohio during this period document notable variation in Victory Garden success rates. Plots managed with companion planting and rotational strategies consistently outperformed those that simply planted without structural design. The difference was not soil quality or rainfall. It was whether the garden had built-in pest deterrents or depended on inputs that were no longer available. Shift forward 30 years. The 1973 oil embargo sent petroleum prices, and with them petrochemical-derived pesticide costs, into sharp increases. Farmers relying on synthetic inputs absorbed those cost spikes directly. Amish operations in Lancaster and Holmes counties, running on plant-based pest management systems, were operationally insulated from that price volatility. Their input cost for pest control was the labor of maintaining specific plants. That cost did not change when oil prices doubled. This is a human scale point. A family growing food during an economic disruption does not have an abstract problem. They have a caloric problem. They have a 60-day problem. The window between planting and first harvest during which a pest collapse can eliminate weeks of investment. What protects that window matters more than what performs well when everything is functioning normally. Amish communities did not merely survive these disruptions in isolation. They continued producing. Their systems did not pause for external inputs to become available again. That is not philosophy. That is engineering that worked when the conditions demanded it most. Between 1945 and 1965, the American agricultural extension system underwent a structural realignment. Following the Second World War, the US government moved aggressively to commercialize the synthetic chemistry developed during wartime. DDT had demonstrated broad spectrum effectiveness against insects in military applications. The chemical industry built civilian distribution infrastructure around it and its successors rapidly. By the mid 1950s, USDA extension agents, the educational pipeline connecting agricultural research to working farmers, were being trained and funded within a system increasingly shaped by chemical company partnerships. This was not a conspiracy, it was an incentive structure. A product that required annual purchase generated annual revenue. A companion planting system required initial knowledge and maintained itself through seed saving and plant propagation. One of these could support a supply chain, the other could not. From a distribution standpoint, the calculus was simple. Spray concentrate could be bottled, labeled, shipped, and sold at a markup. Tansy and wormwood grew in the ground. There was no margin in advising a gardener to plant nasturtiums near their tomatoes. There was substantial margin in selling them a seasoned supply of contact pesticide. Agricultural colleges followed funding. Research focused on products because products produced licensing revenue, corporate partnership grants, and published trials that chemical companies could use in marketing materials. Companion planting was not disproven. It was deprioritized, gradually pushed into the category of folk practice rather than agronomy. The result across 3 generations was a population of home gardeners who had no practical knowledge of plant-based deterrent systems. Not because that knowledge had been tested and found wanting, because the systems that transmit agricultural knowledge had been oriented away from it. The Amish did not participate in that reorientation. Their transmission method, direct, intergenerational, community embedded, did not have a funding structure to redirect. They kept teaching what had worked. Everyone else was taught what could be sold. The distinction matters, and no accusation is required to make it. When researchers at Iowa State University's Department of Entomology began conducting formal field trials on companion planting in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they were not discovering a new concept. They were building an evidentiary record for something that had already been in practice for generations. Their findings on trap cropping, specifically nasturtiums and blue Hubbard squash, as sacrificial hosts for cucumber beetles and aphids, confirmed what Amish garden design had embedded as standard practice. Concentrating pest pressure on a designated plant reduces damage to primary crops by measurable margins. The mechanics were consistent across trial sites. The journal, Crop Protection, published research in the 2000s confirming that marigold interplanting significantly reduced root knot nematode populations in vegetable plots. Nematodes are soil-borne pests that destroy root systems invisibly, below ground, before above-ground damage is apparent. The marigold effect, specifically the compound alpha-terthioneal produced in its roots, operates as a natural nematicide. Trials indicated nematode suppression in the range of 50% or greater under consistent interplanting conditions. Catnip, Nepeta cataria, received attention from Iowa State University researchers in a study published in the Journal of Chemical Ecology after the active compound nepetalactone was found to demonstrate repellent activity against several insect species at concentrations that outperformed DEET in controlled comparisons. The plant had been present in Amish and German heritage herb gardens for generations, primarily near vegetable borders. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, in its 2019 agroecology framework documents, formally recognized diversified cropping systems, including companion planting and intercropping, as effective, evidence-supported approaches to pest management that reduce or eliminate the need for synthetic inputs. The science did not create these findings. It confirmed them. Every mechanism that researchers have since quantified, volatile chemical deterrence, trap cropping attraction, root compound toxicity, beneficial insect habitat creation, was already embedded in Amish garden structure before a single controlled trial was designed. What was practice became data. The practice did not change. The question worth asking now is not whether companion planting works. The research record answers that. The question is why it matters in the specific moment we are currently in. Global food system fragility is not a theoretical concern. The 2022 disruptions to fertilizer supply chains, triggered by the conflict in Ukraine and export restrictions from Belarus, which together accounted for a significant share of global potash production, produced immediate and measurable price increases in food production inputs worldwide. The World Bank documented food price inflation in 2022 at levels not recorded since 2008. And the downstream effect reached household gardens, seed prices rose, soil amendment costs rose, and yes, pesticide product costs rose alongside them. A garden designed around purchased pest control is not insulated from any of this. It is attached to the same supply chain that failed in 2020, that spiked in 2022, and that will face continued stress as climate instability increases the frequency and intensity of drought, heat events, and the range expansion of pest species into new agricultural zones. The IPCC has documented that warming temperatures are accelerating the northward migration of insect pest populations. Species that previously could not survive northern winters are establishing. Gardens that have no structural deterrents, no plant-based volatiles, no trap crops, no companion design, will encounter new pressure without a chemical solution pre-approved and available for those specific species. Endurance does not come from optimizing within a fragile system. It comes from reducing dependency on inputs that the system can withdraw. That is what those Lancaster County farms demonstrated in 1962 and in 1973, and in every disruption since. Not heroics, not ideology. A designed system that continued working when the conditions around it deteriorated. We opened with a question. What were those farms doing differently? The answer was never secret. It was simply inconvenient to sell. Now it is documented. If remembering what was forgotten matters to you, subscribe to Roots of Survival. Every share helps keep this knowledge alive.